Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Decoupling Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Morning to people joining us from the United States, and good evening for friends and colleagues joining us from Japan and Asia. I'm Michael Green, Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS. I'm delighted to welcome you to a roundtable discussion with authors of a new project at CSIS, and I'll introduce them shortly. Let me indulge briefly my own new book shown here over my shoulder, Line of Advantage, Japan's Grand Strategy in the Era of Abe Shinzo, which is a book project I've been working on that tries to tell the inside story of how Japan's current economic, defense, and foreign policy strategies came together, and tracing some of the intellectual roots back to the Meiji period and even earlier. And we'll be doing an event on that at 2 p.m. on April 5th, which you'll hear about shortly. But today we're talking about technology, and we're delighted to have some of the leading thinkers on U.S. technology policy and U.S. strategy in Asia. The project we are going to introduce to you today examines the U.S. policy landscape on emerging technologies and the potential to develop a technology security agenda, a technology security alliance with Japan, which is critical as the US and China enter a new phase of technological competition. The US cannot do this alone. We need to cooperate with key technological superpowers like Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and others would be in that camp, but Japan will be particularly important in fusing common approaches to protection of critical technologies and supply chains, aligning our economic security legislation and policies, innovating in 5G, AI, cyber, quantum, and other emerging fields. This year, the CSIS Japan Chair has invited experts to contribute papers on 5 topics related to economic security and our alliance with Japan. Rob Atkinson has written on and will speak to corporate views on international technology competition. Jim Lewis of CSIS has written on and will talk about economic security tools, including investment screening, export controls, and the like. Ambassador Kurt Tong has written a paper on configuring the U.S. Japan Economic Security 2+2 for this new agenda. Jennifer Jacket and Charles Edel have written on regional perspectives and regional alignment on technology security strategies. And Kazuto Suzuki on Japan's technology policy, the new economic security legislation in Japan, competition and cooperation with China, and the U.S.-Japan alliance. We will publish these working papers in April on our website, and part of a larger edited volume that includes 4 additional authors we have working on the same issues from a Japanese perspective, scholars and business leaders from Japan. I'm going to start today's conversation with a discussion on regional perspectives on technology competition with China and Japan's own approach. Then I'll shift to the debate in Washington and the potential to develop better aligned and more effective U.S.-Japan cooperation in technology competition. And then I'll take questions from you, from the audience. You can submit the questions, and some already have, I see, by clicking the Ask Live Questions Here button, which is on the CSIS event website. So our panel. I'll turn first to Charles Edel. Charlie is the Senior Advisor and the inaugural Australia Chair here at CSIS. He previously taught at the University of Sydney, where he was a Senior Fellow at the U.S. Study Center, and he served on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff from 2015 to 2017. He's also a leading expert on John Quincy Adams. No panel goes by without me asking Charlie something about JQA, who had views on technology, as Charlie's book on JQA demonstrates. Charlie's co-author is Jennifer Jacket at Australia National University, who, because of the time difference, couldn't join us. Second, I'll turn to Kazuto Suzuki, Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at Todai, Tokyo University, my alma mater. Suzuki-san is also a senior fellow of the Asia Pacific Initiative, an independent policy think tank in Tokyo. And he focuses on the intersection of science and technology in international relations. Rob Atkinson is founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. He's previously served as co-chair of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy's China-U.S. Innovation Policy Experts Group and vice president of the Progressive Policy Institute. And perhaps most important of all, I've convinced Rob to teach a course at Georgetown University, where I direct Asian studies, on this very topic on U.S.-China technology policy, immensely popular course, and I suspect some of his students are listening in. Then Jim Lewis, Senior Vice President and Director of the Strategic Technologies Program here at CSIS. Before joining CSIS, Jim was a diplomat and a member of the Senior Executive Service with extensive negotiating, political, military, regulatory experience, and was Senior Advisor for the UN groups of governmental experts on information security. Jim is much sought after by U.S., Japanese, Australian, allied governments for his thoughts on technology innovation and technology security and cybersecurity. And finally, Ambassador Kurt Tong. Kurt is a partner at the Asia Group Consultancy. He served as Consul General and Chief of Mission in Hong Kong and Macau, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs in the State Department, and Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, and the APEC Ambassador. Kurt also, within his Foreign Service career, I know from my time in the White House, was the originator of some of the major pillars of U.S. economic statecraft today, things like the U.S.-Korea Economic Free Trade Agreement and so forth. So Kurt is a kagemusha, a power behind the scenes who's really shaped American economic statecraft. And now, of course, technology is at the center of that thinking. So let me start with Charlie. I'm going to do this as a bit of a dialogue and ask our authors and panelists some questions to kick things off, and then we'll go to the audience. So Charlie, thank you. Sorry your co-author couldn't join us, but don't blame her given the time difference. So let's start with this. What are the different regional responses you see to U.S.-China competition, particularly in this struggle for domination of key emerging technologies? It puts countries that have supply chains with China, sourcing in China, in an awkward position. But then, of course, we also have supply chains with China. So how are allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific responding to this growing competition?
Well, thanks very much, Mike, for organizing this, for inviting us. And even though, as you noted, she's not here, I really would like to thank Jennifer Jackett for her terrific work contributing to our joint paper. So look, the way that we've teed this up is we're going to go broad and then we're going to get specific. We're going to kind of go across the region and then we'll get more specific to U.S. and Japanese policy levers. And of course, Mike, you can ask me about John Quincy Adams. For those of you who don't know, he was America's 6th president, great Secretary of State, talked about technology a lot, but that's not the focus here today. So the responses across the region to this growing technological competition have taken a lot of different shapes. They've been unilateral national responses, but they've also been both bilateral and multilateral. So, a couple of examples. The US and Japanese leaders and US and South Korean leaders have each committed to deepening cooperation on sensitive supply chains, particularly semiconductors. On upstream supply issues, Australia and the US have pursued critical mineral cooperation, which are, of course, key inputs to some of what we're talking about. We can go a little bit further that US and South Korean leaders agreed in 2021 to work together to develop open and transparent and efficient 5G and 6G networks. Shortly thereafter, not to be outdone, US and Japan announced the Competitiveness and Resilience Partnership. When we begin to think beyond the bilateral, we can point to initiatives like the Quad, which established a critical and emerging technology working group. And of course, one of the biggest ticket items that we've seen is AUKUS, which is perhaps the most ambitious of minilateral groupings. Now, that trilateral security partnership between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, announced in September 21, really does commit, I think, to a step change in defense technology cooperation. That middle word is key here, because even though submarines, nuclear propelled submarines, have really made the headlines, it's the cooperation to work together on issues like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cyber and undersea capabilities that is thought to work to propel the defense and industrial bases of those three countries to work more closely. Now, stepping back for a second, a couple of things here. I would say the increasingly prominent focus on critical technology across the Indo-Pacific does not obviously just reflect US concerns. Rather, from India to Australia to Japan and South Korea, there are a converging set of strategic imperatives and complementary, if not quite aligned, capabilities pulling Indo-Pacific democracies together despite their own unique national contexts. Now, all of these countries have an ambition to both advance their own technological competitiveness to support their own societies and their own economies, as well as develop cutting-edge military capabilities. They also have a shared interest in reliable, secure, and diverse supplies of critical technologies. And perhaps most importantly, they all have stated that they want that technology to be developed and used in a way that aligns with their liberal democratic values. So the technological diplomacy that we see occurring across the region is a positive development, but for like-minded democracies to maintain and capitalize on it, current political momentum really needs to be aligned more closely and even mapped more thoroughly than it has to date.
So you and Jennifer propose in your paper what you call an Indo-Pacific Technology Partnership, IPTP, to try to organize these like-minded states so that we're not just aligned in thinking, but actually aligned in policy. Tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. Well, when in doubt, come up with a new acronym, and we really thought that IPTP would be a good one here. Now, the idea here is really that starting with a core of like-minded democracies and then potentially building out from there, that in order to both defend and advance their critical technologies, they needed to do so in a way that was complementary, coordinated, and comprehensive. And the idea is not to reinvent the wheel, not to reduplicate other efforts, but really there is space for building something a little bit larger among broad and like-minded nations. And we're talking about ones that can include major players like South Korea and smaller players like New Zealand. And we thought that if you began to think about this, a loose alliance, I would say to start, there were three broad areas that we thought could inform the basis of an agenda for this that could have greater impact. Harmonization, regulation, supply chain security initiatives, and regional infrastructure investment. Just to skim the wave tops on those, Mike, on the harmonization of regulations, we have seen that obviously there is some degree of similar undertakings going on in almost every major democracy across the Indo-Pacific on issues like foreign investment screening, export controls, critical infrastructure regulation. And the first issue should really be, and critically, how you regulate research into sensitive technologies at universities, but that have application elsewhere. And I would note that the goal here is not complete policy alignment. That's not going to happen between countries, but some degree of shared best practices can really help mitigate some of the risks that are out there from hostile actors. On supply chain initiatives, this really does include primarily would focus in on areas like research and testing of 5G and next generation communication technology, joint standard development, cooperation, multilateral standard setting fora, and then finally, regional infrastructure investment. So we're talking about hardware, but we are of course also talking about software as well, and thinking through what financial backing there needs to be. To draw back, right, every country has efforts to fund initiatives in third countries. But whether or not those are mapped really clearly to make sure that everyone knows where everyone is working and where there are gaps that exist, and therefore where we can be a value add to each other and prioritize certain areas is really where we would like to see this go. That's the basis for starting something, because there's so many initiatives in this space that now beginning to map which ones are the most important, and where our national policies are beginning to align in a way that we can tee them up together is, I think, valuable here.
Got to ask, you've written a book on him, I've written a chapter on him. What would John Quincy Adams think? He, 200 years ago, was an honorary Secretary of State getting ready to be president, and he thought a lot about national power, technology, and America in the Pacific. So is he looking down from heaven on Charlie Edel's proposal right now and thinking that's proper American strategy?
He is indeed smiling at this talk. In his inaugural address as president, he gave a talk saying that if American national competitiveness were to remain at the forefront, you would have to have investments by the government into critical and emerging technologies. Not quite in those words. He actually called for the United States to copy the best practices of the European governments who are investing into science and technology, and to create, in his words, lighthouses of the sky to light the way forward for all of us. So yes, John Quincy Adams is our model and our torchbearer here.
A little bit like Xi Jinping, like made in America 1825, but we'll leave JQA at that. Let me turn to Suzuki Sensei. Kazuto, I want to first ask about Japan's view of this intensifying U.S.-China competition in technology. But let me preface it by saying, 10 years ago, Jim Lewis and I were getting frequent visits from METI, from JBEC, from the new NSC, urging the U.S., the Congress, the Obama administration to strengthen import screening and export controls, to strengthen cooperation on 5G. A lot of what you see now in U.S. legislation and U.S. policy was being quietly urged by Japanese officials before it became U.S. policy. Now, when you read the Japanese newspapers, it looks like Japan is having to react to all of these American initiatives, which in some ways is classic U.S.-Japan relations dynamic. But with that as a preface, tell me how in Tokyo and with experts like yourselves is the U.S. approach and the intensifying competition being viewed?
Well, I think the Japan is viewing the intensifying U.S.-China competition as a risk and opportunity. And for the risks, I think it's there are risks for losing business with China, because of the intensifying the regulations. And what we did in Asia Pacific initiative, we did the interview and research with 100 Japanese companies of the consequences of the new bill on the economic security in Japan. And one of the outcome of this research was that many Japanese companies, more than 50%, are considering that there will be more difficulties, not the getting into China, but getting into the US market, because the United States will have more intensifying the screening on the investment and the much tighter regulation on the export control. And there will be closer scrutiny on the technology, and there will be a Buy American issue. So, these are the things that may not work for Japanese companies. So that was the interesting outcome of the one of the outcomes of the research. But nevertheless, I think it's also an opportunity, because the Japanese government, as you mentioned, has a tradition of the industrial policy. Japanese government were having all this toolbox of providing these subsidies and the government instructions for the industry to do this and to do that. And in fact, I think this is an opportunity to for some industry which is much less competitive in the face of the Chinese companies in the global market, that the Japanese companies will have more subsidies and more opportunities for government support. And also, there will be much less competition with the with U.S. companies in in Chinese market. So in this way, the Japanese companies see this as an opportunity as well. So I think the intensifying the technological competition, which leads to the which may change the dynamics of the industrial competitiveness in Japan and in United States, but also I think there will be another impact on the Chinese, industrial competitiveness as well. Particularly the question of the semiconductor. The U.S. policy for regulating export of the semiconductor-related issues, I mean the materials and the machines, which may lose the opportunity for the Japanese companies to export to China. Some companies which are sending all the machines to make the semiconductors, such as Tokyo Electron, or selling the silicon wafers to China. They lose business in China, but at the same time, this regulation makes the Chinese semiconductor industry much less competitive because of the lack of investment, the lack of technological capabilities. And this will work better for the Japanese products, for example, for Sony and other companies, which is now in competition with China. So I think there is always a risk and opportunity for in this context.
Having spoken to Japanese CEOs in the tech sector and some American CEOs, I have to say I think the Japanese companies, despite some mix of anxiety and seeing opportunity, Japanese companies are much more closely aligned with the Japanese government than U.S. companies tend to be with the U.S. government. And I'll ask Rob Atkinson about this in a minute, but it also seems to me U.S. and Japanese companies are not particularly well aligned on these questions right now in terms of how they relate to the policies. And I first went to Todai and studied in Japan in the late 80s, and then did my PhD at Johns Hopkins on Japanese industrial policy. And in those days, kacho, office directors in charge of different sectors were happy doing gyosei shido, administrative guidance. And today I can see in METI and the Japanese government that same kind of excitement at the turn of some kind of industrial policy. Very, very natsukashi, very nostalgic for the 80s and 90s. Right now, there's legislation in the Diet Economic Security Bill. There's also legislation in the U.S., of course, on technology competition, especially in semiconductors. It may be that these two packages pass the Diet and the Congress in time to give the governments a lot more of a toolkit to work with. But you've sometimes been a little bit skeptical about the Economic Security Bill. What can we expect will be in it, and what do you think of it in Japan?
Well, there are four pillars of this economic security bill. One is the resilience of the supply chain, the protection of the critical infrastructure for two, and the third is the secret patents or classified patents, and the fourth is the promotion of the science and technology industrial base. So I'm not going to discuss each of those, but from the technological competition and the technological strategy part, I think one of the interesting one is the fourth one for the coordination between the government and industry or academics to invest into a particular industry, such as AI, the quantum technology, biotechnology for the dual use purposes. And for a long time, Japan had sort of a big gap between the academics and the government. The academics are very skeptical about the cooperating with the military-related technology. So they focus more on the civilian use of the technology. And this bill is trying to bridge the gap between the government and academics and industry to coordinate more for promoting the technological issues for the dual use technology. But the part that I am skeptical about is the question of the balance between the Japan, China, and U.S. relationship, because the many Japanese companies are heavily invested in China, and the administrative guidance the METI and the other ministries are trying to exercise is going to contradict with the business interests. So I think the conflict, although the government is happy to come back to this traditional industrial policy, I think the time has changed dramatically. I think, during the time of the 1980s, the trade friction time, then it was okay to do the business with the United States for the security reasons, and it wasn't really prohibit. The government didn't prohibit to do the business with the United States, but today it is a government intervention for the private businesses and private investment. So that will make some friction between the business and the Japanese government, and that is something new. So I think this is the government needs to take a little closer look and make a much more delicate approach to the relationship. So it's I think that if Japanese government is trying to do the exercise the sort of an old-fashioned way, then it will make a big trouble in the future.
So this is a good segue to you, Rob. Speaking in particular about U.S. competition against a technological adversary, well, the last time we did that was Japan in the 80s, late 80s and early 90s. And there's that famous quote from, I think it was George Herbert Walker Bush or maybe Reagan's head of the Council of Economic Advisors, when they were debating whether or not the U.S. needed an industrial policy to compete with Japan. He said, I don't care if America makes computer chips or potato chips, as long as the market dictates it. And then, the advocates of industrial policy, attacked that. And then a few years later, the Wall Street Journal had an article showing that actually, if you look at biotechnology, in those days, potato chips are more advanced than computer chips. So there's this whole debate, and it's back again. It's very nostalgic, and yet it's different. China is a different kind of competitor. Are there lessons we can draw from that earlier period? Are there differences that should alarm us or make us smarter when we think about this next, great national focus on a technological adversary that, of course, also is a military and ideological adversary?
Yeah, well, thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. There definitely are similarities and differences. As I taught last night in my class at Georgetown, we were talking about the history of industrial policy, and a student asked, "Well, have we never had this?" And clearly, they're too young to remember the Japanese challenge, if you will, pretty serious challenge. But the U.S. took that quite seriously. People forget that, including the Reagan administration, the first Bush administration. There was a slew of policies, programs, initiatives that were put in place by the government to respond to that challenge. One of the big differences, there are two big differences, though, three big differences between the Japan challenge and China. Japan was our ally. They were never a military threat to us. Number two, Japan, while they were big, they weren't as big as China is now. Number three, Japan had the rule of law. They might have some protectionism or this or that, but they generally had the rule of law, and they didn't generally steal intellectual property. It was much more aligned with our system. And then fourth, the whole issue now with China is that China is basically not, even at the height of Japan's ambitions, they were still Ricardians. They wanted to be good at a few things, but not everything. China wants to be good at everything. And then finally, our companies one of the issues why our companies back then actually took action, and that's relevant to today, is our companies were largely shut out of the Japanese market. It was more of a closed market for Japanese firms, and our firms were frustrated, said we want to get in, and so they were like, yeah, let's come together and take action. China learned from that lesson. China let our firms in, and it's a Faustian bargain. They intentionally let our firms in part to buy them off. And we see that now with Wall Street, where the Chinese are saying, Wall Street, come on in, come on in. And Wall Street is salivating on that. The big investment banks completely salivating on that. And the Chinese know that if they can get Wall Street to be more engaged in the Chinese market and see the dollar signs or the yuan signs, that they're going to oppose or resist active measures of decoupling or other things like that. So there's a lot of big differences, but the major big difference now is that American firms are much more deeply tied to China, and China has the ability to punish them at will. The Japanese government never did that, never threatened to do that, never could do that. And so our firms are in some ways being held hostage, and as a result are not full-throated advocates.
That's really interesting, and it may be there's another difference, which is how we got out of this with Japan, how the relationship recovered, which is while the Japanese government, I think in the 80s and 90s, Japan's FDI was 1% of GDP. It was very, very limited access for all but a handful of US companies. But because of the appreciation of the yen in the 80s, and some protectionist measures and industrial policy, Japanese foreign direct investment in the US surged. And so by the 90s, the late 90s, you had almost every state in the union had significant job creation because of Japanese investment in, good, well-paying manufacturing and technology jobs. China doesn't have that. And so in some ways, we've surveyed the American public and thought leaders. In some ways, it's easier for the politicians to organize competition against China because there are many, many fewer stakeholders in the US who see the benefits of Chinese investment the way they saw Japanese investment. But you're right about Wall Street. They are creating leverage for China in pursuit of profits, which is, of course, what they're paid to do. It's not that they're necessarily betraying their shareholders. Is there a way out of this with China, do you think, the way we got out of it with Japan, or is this heading towards increasing decoupling
No, I don't think that. The Japanese, as you noted, Mike. First of all, METI started to encourage Japanese corporations to put facilities here because there was also a conscious strategy. Hey, car company, you put one in Indiana. Hey, car company, you put one in Ohio. You put one in Tennessee. Let's get those Senate votes. So they were quite strategic about how they did that, and it worked out. And as you noted, Plaza Accord with the currency, things like Semitech, things like the voluntary chip restraint. So there were a number of measures that we worked collectively at and to diminish the tensions, make the relationship work better. That's not possible with China. China will not change. Japan changed. China will not change. I think the Trump administration is showing that. The second big thing is, as I said, our companies are much more tied there, and they don't want to rock the boat. So you get companies that are selling an enormous amount of goods or services in China, companies like Starbucks or Walmart or Boeing. They just had that terrible crash, but and then you have companies that are getting their supplies there, that are their core supplies, including in technology industries, and they generally don't want to rock the boat. At least they don't want to rock the boat immediately. I think these companies are open to a long-term evolutional path. Can we move away? But they don't want to have any disruption right away. And one of the issues about that is that evolves, and it evolves when the companies start to lose. And so right now, a lot of U.S. companies think they're not going to lose. They're going to be able to manage and even dominate this relationship. So you look at aerospace, for example. Boeing and Airbus both believe that the challenge from the COMAC C919 is not all that significant. They just don't think it's going to be significant. I think it could be significant. Not going to be significant in the short run, but it could be significant in the long. So imagine if COMAC starts to take over the Chinese market, starts to sell in India, starts to sell in some of these Southeast Asia places. Then you're going to see a shift in Boeing's strategy. Going to be much more confrontational. The problem with that, waiting for that, is that it can sometimes you can wait so long that the respondent is dead. So we had a solar panel industry that was 55-60% of the global market. It's now 5%. So there's not very few interest left in the U.S. to challenge Chinese solar mercantilism because they destroyed us. And so you can imagine EVs being in that dynamic where, right now the major car companies are not really worried about Chinese unfair policies on electric vehicles. But if China starts importing or if exporting to the US EVs, you're going to start to see the auto companies saying, wait a minute, let's respond a little bit like they did with the Japanese challenge. So this all evolves, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I guess the real question is, can we get smart enough, fast enough? Jim, Lewis, we're seeing a lot of tools for technology competition come out of the federal government and legislation, import screening, export controls, and so forth. How would you characterize the toolkit that is being developed in the U.S. right now? Is it too much, too little, wrong tools? What's your sense? Sorry, Jim, you're on mute.
There we go.
Always a technology expert, isn't it?
Yeah. Comes off working off an iPad. But look, these are tools to manage risk, but they're unfortunately tools from the Cold War. So we have two issues with that. We as a country, first, risk is much more amorphous. This isn't a classic arms race. And every time I see someone say race about the competition with China, I know that suggests they may not have fully grasped what's going on. The second is we depend on a rickety alliance. I mean, it's an inheritance from the 20th century. And some allies are stronger than others. Japan is certainly a strong ally, but there's a lot of ambivalence in Europe. They're shifting slowly in our direction, but all the market forces that Rob described are much more powerful in Europe. So we're moving towards two loosely connected supply chains that will compete for a single global market. And in that competition, China's investment policies, its tech transfer policies, which have been predatory since Deng Xiaoping, will continue to be predatory. And how we get a handle on that. With the things we have now, we need to do more. The investment screening is updated when it comes to actually buying companies. When it comes to Chinese investors in the US, a more difficult problem. When it comes to technology transfer, we are still relying pretty much on a 20th century framework, and it probably isn't effective. So updating those will be important. The great weakness here is these are defensive measures, right? And defense will not keep us ahead of China. It will not be a way to build partnerships with key allies in Tokyo and Brussels. So I think we're doing okay. We're certainly doing much better than we were doing 10 years ago, but it's probably not enough.
This is a big question for you, Jim, which is a longer discussion, but maybe you can give us a quick snapshot. We've interviewed university presidents who have argued that if we did not have open innovation in science and especially bioscience, the discovery and invention of vaccines for COVID would have taken 3, 4, 5 months longer if we had shut off, peer review with China. You have, experts on AI and the Internet of Things excited about the rapid reduction in latency that will come with AI and advanced semiconductor production, who are then horrified at the thought that latency will be reintroduced if you have two systems, one based on Huawei, and one based on whatever we come up with. Do you have a sense of a good landing place where we are protecting our technology, innovating, not being ripped off in every sector, as Rob pointed out, under Made in China 2025, where we're able to meet these national security needs, technological innovation, and protect our civil liberties, of course, because this is information technology, where we do all that, but we're not killing the goose that laid the golden technology egg in terms of innovation and productivity and human progress. Can you imagine a sort of landing spot where we get that balance right, or is it going to be, in Deng Xiaoping's words, crossing the river by feeling the stones one at a time.
We're more likely to slip off the stones and land with a big splash. So, and that's actually my question is, do we need the big splash to come to our senses? Because people don't take the contest quite seriously enough. So this seems to be the history hour, but you might remember the Reagan administration considered whether or not to impose restrictions on basic research. And at the end of the day, very close call, they decided not to. That was the right decision. But we did not have Soviet researchers in our universities or labs, right? And so it's very different. We're much more integrated with China. The interconnection makes it difficult. I think people will come up with these, I think they're feeble objections for a fair amount of time. It doesn't matter whether we want to bifurcate the internet or not, the Chinese do. So sit on the sidelines and applaud or take some action. But we're going to need to think about how we move China out of the interconnected economy that we have now. That's the fundamental problem. That sounds a little hard, but it's not that every transaction with China has risk. Clearly, most of them do not, and we should continue. But we need to do a better job of saying, where is the risk? Where does China's role in the research universe make sense? One question, I'll put it to the group too, is that we still have regulatory connections with China. So you might have seen there was recently a Asian company that acquired an American chip maker's facilities in China. They had to go through a review in China, and we regard those reviews as binding. How will we rethink the regulatory connection between the U.S. and China? And I think that's going to be a very hard problem.
Kurt Tong, thanks for joining us. You and I did a piece, last year for Nikkei on how to think about technology in the new U.S. Japan Economic 2+2, and you've done a longer, really excellent paper for us for this project on the same. How do you take this agenda into the U.S. Japan Economic 2+2?
Yeah, so the real challenge here is that is differing perceptions between the United States and Japan, differing sense of urgency in different parts of each society and government, and then the inherent confusion and difficulty of trying to do something really complicated and challenging across cultures, systems, bureaucracies. The idea of having, and this, going back to what you said earlier, the idea of having an economic 2+2 is a great idea. The Japanese side proposed it. They're probably going to have a sense of indigestion if the U.S. does the right thing in terms of what it counter proposes over the coming months. What's needed is a framework that is conceived as catalytic and trying to really change how the U.S. and Japan both working together to make decisions on things like export controls and investment restrictions together. Very difficult, and actively and making decisions and not just yapping about it. It has to be catalytic, and by doing so, it shares the risk inherent in this difficult project of partial technology decoupling with China. Sharing the risk between two economies reduces the risk for each, and that should be a critical objective. There's a lot going on right now with respect to what the economic 2+2 should be. There is, as you would expect, significant bureaucratic inertia where, there's a high-level meeting. Let's write book reports and have those presented to our cabinet secretaries, and they applaud and say, you guys are doing a good job, and nothing changes. That's really would be a huge disappointment to me and a big mistake. So I think this is a really critical juncture to try and bridge the different perceptions about the risk of taking on China on partial technology decoupling. There's differences between different parts of each business community. There's differences in the connectivity between the business communities and the governments. Japan much more connected in the United States, as was Rob was explaining, more differences of opinion. Congress is ready now to decouple, full-on economic decoupling with China, regardless of the risk and not actually understanding the risk to the U.S. economy of doing so. U.S. businesses, parts of it are hoping the whole problem goes away, but much of U.S. business is coming to the recognition that there should be selective, targeted, partial technology decoupling. But you hear me repeating this word partial. That's the question. If we try and take apart the entire technological systems of China and the West, the economic cost will be overwhelming, and it won't work. We'll fail. But if we choose specific technological areas which are most relevant to military capability and most catalytic in terms of long-term economic growth, and also tied to things like human rights and the like, then I think there's a possibility for success.
So CSIS did a huge survey. Rob, Atkinson, Jim, and others were involved and helped us on it about China policy overall, but we had a whole series of questions for the American public and for leaders in industry and universities and labor and so forth, and also in Europe and Asia among allies. And we asked, how much should the US or Japan or Europe decouple? And the answer was amazingly consistent. It was either 19 or 20% for the US public, for European elites, for Japanese and Korean elites. Consistently, only 19, 20% said we should completely decouple. My guess is if we do that survey today, it'll be higher because of Ukraine and increasing tensions and wolf warrior diplomacy and all that. But the lion's share of opinion, a plurality for the public and significant majorities for thought leaders in the US, Europe, and Asia and Japan, was partial decoupling to protect the most advanced technology. So it seems like in a broad aggregate sense, there is kind of an outline of a consensus on this. But all of you have touched on, Suzuki-san and Rob in particular, but all of you have touched on the disconnect between the private sector and U.S. policy, especially in the U.S., but also in Japan. Several of the questions we've received have asked, what is the role of the private sector in shaping this strategy? So let me start with you, Kurt, and we'll go down the line. How can you envision a mechanism for the U.S., Japan, perhaps trilaterally with the EU, to bring the private sector views in to define this proper balance you all are struggling with? So, Kurt, I'll start with you, and then we'll go down the line. How do we get? Should there be a technology industry council with IPTP, Pacific Economic Framework with the 2+2? How would you do it? You've done this a dozen times before in government. How would you bring the private sector in? Kurt, first.
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely critical question, and the goal should be that the private sector is sharing information, technological knowledge, understanding of markets and their future direction, but not having a veto over what the governments ultimately decide is in the strategic interest of the nations. That can be arranged by having the conversations be complex and detailed. And that can be arranged by having a structure for the economic 2+2, and the paper that you and I worked on and now being expanded discusses having specific working groups, getting down into the weeds of issues, pushing down the bureaucratic level, and having more detailed conversations. So there actually is that input. If it's just like a bunch of CEOs sitting around a table with cabinet secretaries jawboning the problem in general terms, that's not going to achieve the objective. It needs to be much more detailed and really compensate for the weaknesses of both governments, I would say, in understanding the technology that they're talking about decoupling. And that's I think there's a variety of ways to organize it in terms of the exact level. The important thing is to have it be detailed, iterative, probably multiple channels, and at a level where people can actually roll up their sleeves and do work constantly. Actually, it means to be like standing committees, not let's meet again next year, but major industry associations and companies assigning specific personnel full time to work with governments on these issues.
We're going to go in reverse order, and for the audience, I have some questions, but we might be able to take a few more, so you can send them through the, I think it's called the Ask a Question button on the website. But we'll go in reverse order. So Jim, you just watch industry slip on the pebble and fall in the river, or is there a more sort of proactive role for the private sector defining these strategies?
Well, one thing we've left out is there's a tension with Congress where there is a much more powerful sentiment that we need to do something about China. And so if I was in the administration and thinking how to encourage the private sector, I would work with Congress, especially as we come up to elections where we know soft on China is not a label anyone will want to wear. We'll need a tech-specific approach. It's not the private sector. It varies from technology to technology, and some are more dependent on China than others. Finally, I'd look at the 5G story. And you might remember at the beginning, there was a lot of hand-wringing and there was no way to beat Huawei. Turned out to be completely wrong. So with the right focus and with some political backing from the administration and the Hill, I think we can move the private sector along. Again, I'd say not every transfer poses risk, and we'll need a better process to decide where there is risk, noting that that's a dynamic situation. A transfer that's not risky now could be risky 5 years from now. And of course, it's always hard to get the bureaucracy to move in less than decadal terms. But I think this is a manageable problem.
Rob, this is your day job. You interact with industry constantly on this. I mean, in a way, I guess you're doing what Kurt Tong describes, constant engagement on these issues with the private sector. Is there a way to engage these diverse views in the formation of a national and a bi-national U.S.-Japan strategy? No, I think there is, and I completely agree with Kurt's framing of that. One of the things I would say, we wrote a paper recently calling for the Commerce Department or NEC or something to create a national strategic industry competitiveness council. Right now, the interactions between government and the administration and industry are ad hoc. One firm going in and lobbying, or one trade association going in and lobbying about something that a burr in the saddle. Has to go beyond that. It has to be more strategic. There has to be a process by which they can present their views. One of the problems is that the administration, and I don't mean this administration, any administration, just simply won't know enough. They don't have the depth of knowledge to be able to look at these issues in fully the way you could. If you want to understand what's going on with semiconductors, you have to talk to SIA and Intel and these companies. If you want to know what's going on in biotech, you need to talk to Merck and these other companies. So what I would suggest are a couple of things. One is that we form some kind of body, both domestically and in an international collaborative way, but we only include strategic industries. I would not want to see, for example, Wall Street on here. Because their interests are not aligned with what we need. This is about strategic industries competitiveness. Second, I would think what we want to ask them to do would be things like, where can we decouple? Where does it make sense to decouple? What's that involved? What kind of incentives do we need? What kind of agreements with other countries do we need to make that happen? Right now, there's just this sort of broad view. If you look at the president's Buy America initiative, it just sort of assumes that, yeah, we can just have this stuff come back. And maybe some of it can, and I'm sure some of it can, but some of it can't. Or if it can, it's going to be very, very expensive. So you need industry involvement and engagement to help set the parameters and understand the depth of the questions. Whenever you do industrial policy, even for the right purposes, you always run the risk of counterproductive rent-seeking behavior. And what you're describing is organizing this in a way to minimize that. I was talking to someone senior in this policy arena in the administration who's trying to organize the U.S. government for this. And this person said one of the biggest challenges they have is within the U.S. federal government, which is massive, the number of officials who actually understand what micron level of semiconductor capability actually constitutes a competitive or national security threat. The number of people in the U.S. government who actually understand that could be counted on one hand. And whereas in the private sector, there'd be dozens, if not hundreds. So Rob, is there a way to mobilize the private sector for expertise, not just for opinions and shaping policies, but actually, I don't want to say as an intel analytical source, but in a way, that's what I am talking about, is, assessments and understanding
where we decouple and so forth. Would you think industry would be up for that? You know, Kurt mentioned seconding people from the technology sector. Possible?
Yeah, I think certainly they would be up for it. I don't know if seconding is too far a bridge, but it's striking. A few years ago, I got a call from somebody in the Defense Department asking me what the Chinese were doing with this particular technology area. And I was like, aren't you guys supposed to know that? I thought that's your job to figure that out. And to your point, we don't have, so this is about two things. Number one, it is about beefing up the capabilities in the federal establishment. They really aren't very strong when it comes to understanding advanced technology and global competition for these sectors. They're just not. And Congress needs to recognize that, allocate funding for it. And also, I would say, Mike, because we've talked about this, institutions of graduate schools, as Georgetown is now doing, also have to start training people in foreign service areas better to understand these technologies. Where 15 years ago, 10 years ago, you didn't study technology if you wanted to be in this field. But then also at the same time, what I would recommend is that the White House identify, 10 strategic industries. It could be built on what the USICA bill does, which initially identifies 10 for NSF, and then create industry councils where you bring in experts from that and really think through. So you could have a council on semiconductors that says, okay, TSMC is going to 3 nanometers. What's really the critical number we've got to keep the Chinese from? How do we get down closer to 3 or 6 or wherever it might be? That's where industry can give you the real input and insight that you're going to need. But it has to be formalized, would be my argument.
Can I ask a question? Because these
Please.
are very think tanky solutions, create councils, set up graduate programs, and I'm not sure they'll work. So what is it you want to get out of this? I mean, that's the first place to start. You want to keep China behind, you want to keep the US ahead. What is it you want out of this?
Yes.
Yeah, Rob, why don't you take a stab at that, and then we'll turn
No,
to
the answer is yes, Jim. Of course, those are all in the service of the overall goal. So I think one of the really interesting questions is, so you have to play defense and offense that we've all discussed. The real question is sort of what's the ratio? I was on a meeting recently where somebody said that, minimum, it's 10% is defense, shouldn't be any more than that. I don't buy that. The claim was it's all of the problems are our own making. I don't buy that. I think it's probably should be 35, 40% defense and 60% offense. In other words, we have to be thinking defensively, and it can't just be de minimis. It has to be things like export controls and CFIUS and other things. But at the same time, we have to have domestic, much better domestic strategies. And Jim, my point with all of this is, I don't think we're going to get those strategies in the nuance and sophistication that they have to be unless we beef up our knowledge base within the federal government. And that's why I think we need to do that.
And engaging the private sector in the way Kurt describes in his paper, and you've been discussing, gets you both that expertise that is lacking in the federal government, but also the ability to form, at least in our very contested system, some kind of consensus about prioritization. Because otherwise, the rent seeking gets worse.
And buy-in.
So, Suzuki-san, buy-in from Japanese companies is critical. My sense is the U.S.-Japan private sector dialogue on this is woefully inadequate. The structure of our industry-to-industry dialogue is also very 20th century. But what do you think? Is there a possibility to integrate the private sector bilaterally for U.S.-Japan together?
I think it's possible, and I agree that this is very woeful. But there is a very growing interest because of this new bill on the economic security. Each company, major companies, are now setting up the offices of the economic security. They become more aware of the importance of the economic security, and they are calculating the risks, security risks of the, exporting this to, China. I think this raising awareness is an important part, and I think the government is successful to initiate the idea that the company is in the front line, and for many years during the 20th century system in Japan was that it was the government who decides what is the risky things and what is not, and then the companies are just following the government instructions. So it was more about the compliance issue. But now it is the company which needs to take the risks, and they have to calculate the risks, and they analyze the situation and understands the possibility. And I think this bilateral private coalition will improve that idea of what the company should do when it comes to the question of the economic security and the security as a whole, to mitigate the risks.
This was a really excellent discussion. Thank you. And I think maybe in a small way we've moved everybody and all the stakeholders involved a little bit closer to what Suzuki-san describes. Kurt, Rob, Jim, Kazuto, thank you. Charlie had to catch a flight, and his co-author is probably asleep right now. But hope this also helps you with the final drafts of your chapters, and we look forward to publishing this, and people can read in more detail your ideas in about a month's time. Excellent discussion. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.